Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and we're beginning a conversation across a number of divides in the United States in partnership with Kevin Wilhelm, who's the CEO of Sustainable Business Consulting in Seattle, Washington, previous guest on our show. And he's also the author of How to Talk to the Other Side, a great book about talking across the chasm we are here to address, as well as professor at Harvard University. Hi, Kevin. How are you today?
Great. Thanks for having me, Mitch.
We're also joined by Todd Myers, who's the director of the Center for the Environment at the Washington Policy Center, a Seattle-based research and think tank organization. He's also a member of the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council and former staff member at the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. His book, Eco-Fads, How the Rise of Trendy Environmentalism is Harming the Environment, came out in 2012 and has remained a subject of conversation for a long time since. Welcome to the show, Todd. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Well, hey, it's good to have both of you here to talk about how we talk across the political divide. Kevin, you are a self-acknowledged left-leaning, but I believe fairly centrist person. Todd, you are a self-acknowledged right-leaning, but basically centrist person. How can we talk about the following things is what I'd like to cover today: climate policy, carbon taxes and credits, and renewable energy. So I want to take a couple of moments to actually have each of you introduce yourself and talk a little about your perspective on where we are as a country at the moment in terms of progress on climate. Todd, how about you? Why don't you start?
Well, from the right, climate can be a difficult thing to talk about, along with a number of other environmental issues. And it's not because conservatives don't care about the environment. When you talk with conservatives, they very much care, right? They're hikers, they're hunters, they're farmers, so they deal in natural resources all the time. And when you talk to them one-on-one, they have many of the same concerns that everyone else has. The challenge becomes with so much of the environmental discussion is that people skip the step of talking about what they agree and jump right to what they disagree about. And the problem with that is that in public policy, you try to head the other side off at the pass by saying climate change isn't a big crisis. Because if you can say it's not a problem or it's not a crisis or something, then you can stop the policy that you don't want.
Right.
The minute people are afraid that the minute they say the environment is a problem or climate change causes risk or other things like that, then they commit themselves to all sorts of things they don't like. So they simply say, this is not an issue we even need to deal with because I don't want the Green New Deal. That, I think, makes it very difficult to have an honest conversation. So somebody like me, who they know, right, or a conservative, when they know that I'm a fellow traveler, they will say things to me that they would never say in public. And I think that makes it difficult. And it means that each side has to listen to each other more carefully so that they don't sort of inspire that defensiveness about, where are you trying to take me on this? What are you trying to bait me into? And I think that makes it really difficult. But I also think you will find, shockingly, that there are a fair number of things that everybody agrees on, even if we're afraid to say it out loud.
Kevin, what's your take on this challenge of having this conversation?
First of all, I would agree with everything Todd said. My feeling is that when you talk about climate, I mean, again, I'm the head of a sustainability consulting business and I teach on this subject, but I feel like so often the way that it's put out in the media is done really, by the progressives or people that are, pushing for climate action, is it's not connecting with people kind of in their day-to-days or in language they understand. Mm-hmm. Every time I, watch an article that's about, look at the polar ice caps melting or, polar bears drowning, what's happening to the permafrost in the Arctic, I agree with it. And then they say something like, and it's going to be X number of parts per billion. We're at 407 parts per billion and parts per million, and we need to be at 350. And I'm like, who the heck understands that? Or if they say, and if we don't take action by 2100, these will be gone. And I think for most people, they go, well, 2100, I'm not going to be around then, not my problem. And so I think, a lot of the issues where I see some of the difficulty on people who are in the climate advocates is that they're really pushing the science aspect of it. And to most people, it's no different than pushing organic chemistry. It just doesn't hit them. Whereas to what Todd's talking about and putting about shared language, when you talk to people about extreme weather events, and I think here, say in the Pacific Northwest, people that maybe were climate, skeptics, after they had to be inside, during a pandemic during the summer because the wildfire smoke was so bad, that was something we could all, have a common shared experience upon. And if we talk about, oh my gosh, wasn't it so horrible this summer that during a pandemic, the one thing we could do was go outside and get, recreate or get our kids out. But that was even taken away from us. We had to be indoors. There starts a conversation about kind of shared experience. And then you can go on to the kind of the bigger conversations. And I feel like a lot of it is the like Todd mentioned, a lot of it is the language that people are using, and also the lack of trust of what Todd was saying of if you get me to agree on something here, what's the catch? What are you trying to do in this? And if we can instead talk about that shared aspiration where we have common ground, and maybe tackle some of the smaller things that are more tangential that people can grab, then it's easier to have the conversation.
Well, I think there's an analogy here to what people are going through with COVID too. There's a lot of misinformation about COVID, and there's a lot of skepticism about the impact that it's going to have on us individually because, and I hear this question all the time, but do you know anybody who has died? I just happen to have an employee whose uncle died on Monday of COVID. I know a couple of other people who have passed as a result of the disease as well, but many of the people I know still see this as an abstraction because, fewer than less than 10% of the United States have even contracted the disease. Now, we're at a moment where because of this great pause in our normal life, we are potentially ready to reset our thinking in some ways. Kevin, do you see some tangible experience like the wildfire that is going to bring people together around some key discussions about climate policy in the next year or two?
I do. I think, what I've seen certainly in with our business clients and even our government clients is that the pause that you're describing, Mitch, has allowed people to really reflect and say, what are we doing here? What kind of what's life all about? What do we want to really accomplish?
What do we value?
Right. And I think if you ask anybody on the left or right, they all share the same aspirations. They want to have a healthy family, a good job. They want to, be able to retire. They want their kids to be safe and have good educations. And that reset, what we've seen is that in the corporate world where for years when you would say, let's take action on climate change and say an organization's three biggest impacts were their energy use, their business travel, and their commuting, they always, kind of thought, well, I can tackle energy, but, business travel, we need to fly to our clients, because they need to see us. And our employees, they got to be here in the office because I don't trust them. Well, those two myths have been busted. Mm-hmm. And in what I'm really hopeful because I feel like now you can also bust other myths that are out there and say, what other assumptions do we have about the way business was done that we can change? And how can that impact policy? And I think that there is that opportunity. And, when oil went into the negative, when all the oil reserves were, in Oklahoma were full and max capacity, and oil went to negative $31 a barrel, it all of a sudden flipped the idea that having, fossil fuels in your balance sheet as an asset into a liability really is a way that has woken people up.
So, Todd, do you think that the disruption in our lives, particularly the supply chains that we've seen as part of the pandemic, has made business leaders and right-leaning folks generally more aware of the fragility of the way we do things? And are they thinking more about how to change it in order to create resilience?
I think it's not so much the fragility, but the opportunity, right? I mean, the notion that we would all do, meetings online and be comfortable with it was just not something that was realistic a year ago, and now it is. And that doesn't mean that people won't get back and do meetings in person. They absolutely will. Everybody wants to do that. But it also means that a larger number of meetings will be online, which has a positive benefit for energy use and the bottom line. So I think that the people are assessing new opportunities because now we are comfortable with doing those sorts of things in a way we weren't before. But I think one analogy with COVID and climate is the danger of politicization and undermining progress. So in COVID, right, we get these lectures about, oh, you have to stay at home and you have to lock down. And if you don't, you're risking your family and other things like that. And then, you know, the governor of California goes to the French Laundry, and the mayor of Austin flies to Cabo San Lucas and does a video telling people not to leave their homes. And then people who recognize that COVID is a risk, but then they hear that, then they just get really angry. And then they just say, you know, you guys are playing politics with a serious situation. Why should I take you seriously? And we see the same thing with climate when you say, okay, climate change is a crisis. Oh, but I'm also going to use it to fund all these other political agendas that I have. And it becomes and then it's perceived as a Trojan horse for other things. Well, then now you're just making people angry, who you really should be trying to appeal to and say, look, I'm serious about this. What those things do is they send a message of, I'm actually not that serious about this.
Well, is that hypocrisy, or is that human weakness that we're seeing? Because, you know, one of the problems with any of this conversation is people tend to demand some perfection, whether it's ideological perfection or just environmental perfection. They want to see complete consistency, but in fact, people do dumb things all the time.
No question.
Does the way that we use media today kind of amplify that challenge?
There's no question that people do dumb things, but you have to recognize that those dumb things undermine your goal. So you can't, if you do dumb things and you say, well, hey, hey, don't judge me on that. I did a dumb thing. You have to say, well, no, you're going to pay a price for people you support or you doing something that undermines your message. And don't be surprised when people who are skeptical to start with seize on that and say, aha, you're not really serious. So look, nobody's going to be perfect. I'm just saying that to understand the other side and why people are skeptical and why they are resistant, those sorts of things all play into that. And if you get mad and you say, no, you can't use that against me, you're not understanding and you're not appreciating their reaction to a legitimate reaction to what they see as either hypocrisy or anything else.
So Todd, do you see some policy ideas for addressing climate change that you believe people can have that conversation about without the gotchas?
Yeah. So the great thing is that I think the area that I focus on now is technology. And personal technology, because it puts the power in the hands of people. You don't have to believe that climate change is real to want to save money on electricity and gasoline and other things like that. And so there's lots of opportunities to do that, from smart thermostats to, hybrid or electric vehicles, to all sorts of things that help us live our lives better. And one of the arguments I make to conservatives is, look, you're going to save money, but we're also going to send less money to Russia, who's not exactly our friend. So those sorts of things help. There is a corollary again to this in COVID. The state is trying to do, contact tracing, where they reach people and say, okay, who have you talked to try to control it? But they just don't have enough resources and they're doing a very bad job. So what did they roll out? They rolled out an app that puts the power in the hands of individuals, and they think that will actually be better. We see that in a lot of ways with personal technology and helping you reduce your energy footprint and things like that. If you get rewarded, it doesn't matter what your ideology is. And the other thing is technology can't be overturned at the next election. You don't have to worry that Joe Biden or Donald Trump is going to be the next president, right? You're going to continue to do what you do. So that's where I would like is to put more power in the hands of individuals through these technologies and policies that encourage that, rather than hoping that the next politician will do what we want.
So, Kevin, you and I have talked about the fact that there are huge opportunities for renewable energy businesses, for companies that find ways to introduce sustainable living to a lot of consumers. Where do you see the opportunity to begin to talk about policies we can put in place that would encourage that economic growth that I think we all agree, pulls us forward as a society?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a yes, and I completely agree with Todd. And I downloaded the COVID app right away, because it's like, hey, here's something I can do. We bought a Nest thermostat and are doing all the individual things. However, I see the really big opportunity. It's almost like if you can take it out of decision makers' hands. I think if we can get it out of politics, the best thing that we can do in terms of overall policy on climate is to just make the business case. And it's one of the things that Todd mentions, and I've mentioned it throughout the book, that, the whole reason that utilities moved away from coal was not anything to do with environmental issues. It was because natural gas was cheaper. And now that solar has become the cheapest source of electricity, the utilities are racing to put more renewables in the ground because they found that it's cheaper. And also, as the markets for natural gas and oil, the prices aren't as high. So it's purely an economic situation that Todd was describing, where it's in these utilities' best interest to move to renewables, and then it takes it out of policymakers, it takes it out of politicians, and it also takes it out of the individuals. And I think that that is one thing that my wife and I, we did this road trip all the way from Seattle to Kalamazoo, Michigan, during COVID in an RV. And when you went across, say, I-70 or I-80 or even I-90, 5 years ago, there were oil wells in Wyoming and in Kansas. And now they're giant wind farms. And there's giant solar fields in the areas that in Iowa where there used to be corn. And so by reaching out and going to, say, farmers and saying, we know you're getting nailed by COVID restrictions. We know that commodity prices are low, these tariffs that are coming at you. What can you do to raise your baseline income so that you can keep your family farm within your family for the next few generations? Here's a way to do it. Put some solar panels, put some wind up there, because that's always going to be there. And it enables you to get that baseline economic income to their kind of core, what they want. And I think that is the type of policy and thinking that needs to be put out that removes the politics, that removes everything that Todd was just saying.
So let's add
one thing to what Kevin just said to make the point again, which is that the new Seattle arena where they're going to have the hockey team is named Climate Pledge Arena. And so all of my conservative friends who know that I work on environment reached out to me and was like, can you believe this? This is so ridiculous. This crazy, stupid virtue signaling name. And I said, yeah, I get it. I mean, I think it's sort of silly, having worked in sports myself, to call it Climate Pledge Arena. But I'll tell you what, they're going to meet that goal. And the reason they're going to meet that goal is because it's good business for them, not just in terms of economics, but because they've put their company's reputation on the line. And this is a signal, a marketing signal. So, where I see Seattle and King County and Washington State and other jurisdictions missing all of their CO2 targets, Amazon's going to make theirs because they've put it on the top of an arena, and there's a good business case for it.
So let's turn to the question of carbon, because I think we all agree that there's too much of it in the atmosphere. It is contributing to warming, and we want to reduce it. Without getting into all of the details of the science, that's a generalization I believe most of us can understand and at least acknowledge represents a viable truth. Do we need, given the already clear incentives for business to make this transition, to tax carbon or to create a carbon credit system in order to encourage rapid conversion to renewables? Todd, you first.
So I have supported revenue neutral carbon tax in the past. I think that's the simplest, right? The problem is that it gets wrapped up in, they want to tax it so that then they can provide subsidies to all sorts of their friends, which I don't.
So to clarify for everybody, what's a carbon or a revenue neutral carbon credit?
So what has been proposed in some places is that basically you raise the price of CO2. It's primarily a gas and energy tax. It's, I think, 90-something% of where the money comes from. And then you would reduce other taxes, like sales taxes in Washington State, or in other states have income taxes. So that's what it would be. So to the state, it would be the same. So what that does is that for the average family is it's like, okay, I'm going to pay a little bit more in gas, but I'm going to pay less in income taxes. And if I can become more efficient and reduce my CO2 emissions, either through energy or gas or something like that, I'll actually end up getting a tax cut, which is great. So it's a very much win-win for the environment and for your pocketbook. The problem with that is that it gets wrapped up in a lot of politics, and people, they don't want to do revenue neutral. They want to raise taxes and they want to spend the money in political ways. And so then people, who are on the right, who are skeptical of this, like I said, as a Trojan horse, then they go, aha, see, I've caught you. So I think that becomes difficult. It's not that it's a bad idea. I think it's a very good idea economically. What I think we need to focus on also, though, is energy already costs money, but the demand for energy is very inelastic, because it's hard to see those price signals, the existing prices. And I think using technology and other things to make the cost of that more transparent will help people react more rapidly. I wrote a piece about, in the UK, there's a utility called Octopus Energy. And what they do is that they have energy rates that are pretty basic, that based on the market, but they rise up incredibly during peak demand, because that's when it's most expensive.
Like Uber pricing.
Right, yeah. Like surge pricing. And so, but also because they have to flip on the switch to meet the increased demand, what do they flip on? They're not going to flip on wind. They're not going to flip on solar. They flip on coal and natural gas. So by increasing the price in peak hours, not only do they help people avoid the most expensive electricity, they help people avoid the most carbon intensive electricity. It's simply a price mechanism. And what has happened is that all of these people have written all these little programs and apps for your Apple Watch that say, hey, prices are going up, turn stuff off.
So you're simplifying consumer choices.
Yeah.
Right. But you're making use of existing price signals. You're not adding a carbon tax. Right. So I think it's not merely that we need to, increase the price of carbon, but we need to make more use of the existing price that is already there.
Yeah, and I would say that, as we're talking with clients globally, it's, just a matter of, can you adjust your thermostats at different times of your day to avoid peak pricing? If you've got electric vehicles, can you plug them in but not have the charge start until midnight as opposed to right when you plug them in? I just want to hit on what Todd was saying about the idea of the carbon tax, and I completely agree. I think some of it is the language. I think just calling it a tax in general is a horrible idea, because except for a few very liberal bastions of society, most people don't like paying taxes. And I think if you were to just change some of the name, like call it a carbon dividend, and it's to that point of if emissions come down, everyone will get a check, like they do in Alaska for the oil revenue, and now people hold on to that so diligently. I mean, one of the things that they did in British Columbia was they were saying, what do we want less of? We want less pollution. What do we want more of? We want more jobs. We want more economic development. So what they did was they just did a tax swap where, they kept the revenue neutral, but businesses were incentivized. They lowered their emissions because they would get lower tax rates on hiring employees, and so then they look to hire more employees. And so it's a simple thing. And I would say there's other. I mean, I think Todd's right. The tax is the easiest, simplest way of doing it. What we learned in the United States is that the cap and trade market has actually been more effective. We solved during the first President Bush's administration when he passed the Clean Air Act. The way to attack acid rain and sulfur dioxide was with a cap and trade mechanism instead of a tax. What they found was that they got the reductions 5 times faster and at 1/10 the cost of what it would have been for that. And then George W. Bush actually pushed the restrictions even further because what it did was it had the market mechanism exactly like Todd was talking about for people to just make a business decision to go about this. And it strips the ideology out of it. And I think that In some ways, I was an advisor to the group that was trying to do the first carbon tax in Washington. And I just kept saying, you're talking like an economist. What you need to be talking about is a real person in rural Eastern Washington. And what do they want? What do they hate? They hate taxes. They hate government. What could you offer them instead? And if you said, well, we could offer you a tax cut, and that's really what they were proposing, but they didn't want to call it that because they just, thought it was, that they were trying to game it. And I'm like, that's what you're really offering, not so you just need to kind of meet people where they are.
So this is free forming a bit, but Alaska does pay all of the residents in the state the dividend every year based on the oil revenues. And solar and wind energy is available to all, but it takes a lot of capital to put that into production. If the state created a program, and I'm using Washington because it's potentially a very lucrative business here, to put that infrastructure in and then paid a dividend back to the citizens, like in Alaska, would that be a way to rethink the funding for a rapid transition to renewables? Todd, what do you think?
I don't like that.
Why not? Just tell me why.
The reason is I think it's better to create the right incentives and let people go out and figure out the best way to do it. The problem once you get politics into it is you do things like you subsidize rooftop solar. Commercial solar, especially in Arizona, Kevin's right. I mean, the prices are very low. Yeah. Rooftop solar in Western Washington is ridiculous. I mean, it's very expensive. And yet, what do? We subsidize rooftop solar in Western Washington. So my concern is that when you start to have politicians choose the technologies and say, hey, we're going to do this for you, they don't make the best decisions either for economics or the environment. So, I mean, that was one of the things that the sulfur dioxide cap and trade market did, was it said, look, we don't care how you cut SO2. Do it however you like. You want to do it with technology, you want to buy coal that has less sulfur in it, whatever. So that's great. It was technology independent. And so that's why I worry about proposals like that.
Well, so, and you're also calling out one of the reasons that Alaska's resistance to renewables is so strong. It's because it's embedded in their political system, and they can't give up that dividend without looking really bad to the citizens. So, Kevin, how do we rethink this? What do you think?
Well, certainly your idea is never one that I've actually thought about. I was thinking about, hey, in Alaska, what they're worried about is their dividends just keep getting lower and lower and lower. Yeah. And they're getting upset about it. And so many industries and schools and municipalities who depended on that revenue are now struggling. So I think you're right. I think it's government's place not to determine the technology. I think what they can do is they can build the transmission lines, and they can build the way to distribute it, distributed energy and behind it. I mean, one of the things that jumped out at me was that, Exxon has, 3.4 billion barrels of oil in the Permian Basin that's still underground in West Texas and in southeastern New Mexico. And that is also one of the prime areas for wind in the entire world. It's like the new Saudi Arabia for wind, potentially. And if you could, they've already got the infrastructure, and they've got all these oil wells that are just sitting there that they could literally throw a wind turbine up because they've already got the power already led to that space. If the state were to instead incentivize with distribution lines and say, we don't care what you want to do, but here's a way to massively move forward, then those really rural areas, and it's the same thing in North Dakota. They had the boom with the Bakken oil preserve and the natural gas. And as soon as the market went down, it's a bust time in North Dakota. And they've just built this giant infrastructure that's sitting now empty. However, that's also a prime area for wind as well. And so I think that, looking at it, but instead of having it be a climate discussion, if you had it be about, all of the issues, if it's resiliency, if it's economic development, if it's about jobs, if it's all of those things, I think that's how we need to talk about it. I think that because it gets wrapped in climate, to what Todd's saying, it removes that kind of gotcha scenario. And I think that if you can be about, hey, we want to come in and we want to create jobs and we want to, improve your basic standard of living. That's how extractive industries have done it forever, and that's how renewable industries could do it, but in a more authentic way.
So let's turn to the last thing I want to cover. That is the argument about renewable energy being a job killer or a job creator. And it really is a matter of whether or not your ox is being gored or you're getting an ox. Is that the right way to have this discussion? It always seems to start there. So let's ask you first, Kevin.
I think that it's a red herring. I think it's a scare tactic that both sides use. I think both sides.
Is the solution education so that regardless of who has an ox ward, they can move to a new role?
No, I think it is somewhat education, but it's also showing them a better path forward and hope. So when we were writing the book, How to Talk to the Other Side, we reached out to some communities that were hitting in the coal country, of West Virginia, Kentucky, Pennsylvania. And, they saw coal, but coal represented what the community used to look like in the 50s and 60s, a thriving community with economics and good jobs and, good education and, a vibrant downtown core. And all that's gone. And now all they see is opioid reduction and unemployment. And they attribute it to kind of renewable energy coming at their jobs. And I think that, the reality is that there's twice as many people that work in each of the solar and wind industries as coal. In fact, a recent study this year was that there's only 86,000 jobs tied to the coal industry in those states. There are more people that work at Arby's fast food restaurants than work in the coal industry. And we're not trying to bail out Arby's, we shouldn't. No one should eat at Arby's. But, it's one of these things where, the idea of the job killer versus the job grower, I think what we found was, going into those and having those conversations, it was about showing them, here's a path forward. We honor you, we hear you, we know that you want all of these things. Now, we can't promise you it overnight, but can we retrain the workforce? Can we bring renewable energy into that space? Can we train carpenters and roofers and other areas of some of the technologies that are there without betting on one solution, but finding them a path out of kind of their despair and giving them hope? I think that's critical.
So Todd, you just heard the professor from the elite Eastern University. What do you think of that?
So there's a couple parts of this my brain that gets engaged. The first is the economist part of my brain, which says that I know how to create more jobs. We can ban solar and put everybody on bicycles, spinning on treadmills to generate electricity. And per unit of energy, we will create a lot more jobs that way than by installing solar panels. In that case, a job is a cost, not a benefit.
Right.
So the key is good jobs.
Yeah.
And the key is productive jobs. So right now, somebody working in a natural gas plant produces a lot more wealth than solar panels because just per dollar, it just produces more electricity. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't trade-offs, but it means that a focus simply on jobs is not, it can be misleading. The other thing is that creating a job, a wind turbine job at a production facility in Denmark or even in Pennsylvania doesn't help the people in West Virginia. Now that is just, frankly, that's just called creative destruction. We deal with that all the time, that old industries change and new industries emerge, and you have to find a way to deal with that, and it can be difficult. When we basically shut down timber harvesting on the coast of Washington, there was hope that those people could move to other jobs. A lot of them didn't because they didn't have the education or variety of things. So transitions are always hard. It doesn't mean that you don't do the transition. It just means that they are more difficult than people anticipate. And so much of the discussion, I think, is about, well, wait a minute, solar and wind and these other technologies create all these new jobs. What are you complaining about? It's like, well, how does that help me? I don't have the skills, the education. I'm nowhere close to those. So I think that the discussion about jobs becomes very simplistic when actually it's very complicated. Again, it doesn't, and the projections are wrong. I mean, that's the other thing is that an example I always use is that in 1968, so I used to work for the Seattle Supersonics basketball team. The reason they were called the Seattle Supersonics is that they were founded in the late 60s when it was thought that Boeing was going to build supersonic aircraft because that was the future of airplanes. It was not. And, it almost killed Seattle. So all of these things are very difficult, which is why I think you have to be careful. I think you have to provide the right simple incentives and let it work out over time, but be sensitive to that.
Well, I was here in Seattle when that happened. And as you said, it almost killed the city. But what I do see the right doing is aligning with a group of people like the coal miners, various groups of people whose jobs are at risk, and defending those jobs rather than thinking about whether, it's educating them or simply giving them a living because they no longer have one, so that we make this transition. Because we know that the greater goal of reducing climate warming or climate change is critically, existentially important to humanity.
But
how does
what you just said
right,
there is debatable to them, which is the greater goal of it being an existential concern.
But that's going back to the COVID thing we were talking about earlier, because you haven't seen somebody die of COVID yet, you doubt it. How does the right help those communities, those constituencies, part of the base, deal with the real pain that we have to go through to take this step? Because it is essential to our great-grandchildren who, even though they're not here, do count.
I think one is that I think the problem is that so many promises in the past have been broken. Mm-hmm. So there is always that in the back of people's heads and in Washington State, when you talk about this, people always bring up the timber jobs, that the jobs were killed and they never came back.
Yep.
If you go through Aberdeen, Washington today, there are still buildings that are boarded up from 20 and 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. So that legacy is hard. Conservatives, look, if I said, all right, let's put a price on carbon, but let's cut taxes to double that. I think a lot of people would say, yeah, this seems weird to me. I'm skeptical.
It's math I don't understand.
Huh?
It's math I don't understand.
No, I don't think that. I think it's just that
I think that's what citizens think. They go, I don't get it. It sounds like they're double crossing me.
That's not the. It sounds like you're double crossing it. It's not that they don't understand it. It's like there's another shoe to drop, and I'm nervous about.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
So that's where I think the challenge is. And so what people on the right would rather do is just to say, look, you're telling me that if I don't do this, there's an existential crisis. I'm skeptical of that existential crisis in the first place, but you're telling me that all these people have to lose their jobs because you think that. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
Doesn't sell. No.
So, if you can tell me how you can help those people transition to another job without making the justification be that we're all going to die, then I'll listen.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think one of the things that we are finding in the research of the book is that things like what you're putting out, Mitch, about like the cold job killer or creator, was that really, as we got into the deeper conversation, was really you needed to be listening. And within each layer of the onion, you got to where the anxiety and fear was. And at the end, it had really nothing to do with coal. It was about their livelihood and what was going to impact them today and over the next 3 to 5 years. Not, it's like an existential threat. And I think that, climate is no different than when we saw, an issue like those toys from China 10 years ago that came over with lead. It was like every parent in the world took those toys out of their house overnight because it was immediate. They could see it. They knew exactly what to do. When you talk about something that's 2030, 2050, it's just so far out. However, there is a path. And I think that, what you were talking about, the transition, if we look back to, I'm going to take us out of Washington State. If we look back to the early 90s with the defense industry, remember the Clinton and first Bush election was all about what's going to happen with the
it was the
defense
peace dividend.
Yeah, what are we going to do with the defense contractors if we don't keep building missiles? And one of the things that you need a transition, but you need to show them a path forward. And I think I had friends and colleagues that worked at Hughes, that was building some of the satellites that were going to be working on the Strategic Defense Initiative. Well, they knew they were going to lose their jobs, but there was investment from the federal government and the state government to train and transition them into commercial aspects of it. What did Hughes turn into that division? It became DirecTV. And they basically were able to be retrained and shown that they could keep a job at a similar salary working towards something completely different. And that's what needs to happen. Todd's right. You can't just tell people like, you got to sacrifice your life and your economic livelihood for the greater good, because we've already seen that, with COVID. People were willing to sacrifice for a few months and then nothing got better. And now people are like, I'm tired, I'm fatigued, and that's why deaths are going up again. So if you were able to say to them, here's an opportunity to, whether it's address climate or whatever, if it's getting to your core anxiety of, I need a job, I need a benefit, I need to be shown a path forward that is real and isn't tied to something that's way off in the future or some existential threat, but it's like, I'm going to find a way to transfer your job skills from A to B and address your core anxiety that's right at the surface, then some of those barriers come down.
I want to thank both of you for this conversation. It's been great. I appreciate the time you've taken and the fact that we started talking about show, don't tell, and we really came back to show, don't tell. We're in the midst of a very challenging era, but that's the benefit of being alive. You got to face challenges. And Todd Myers, who is the director of the Center for the Environment at the Washington Policy Center, I want to thank you, as well as Kevin Wilhelm, CEO of Sustainable Business Consulting. We're going to be back with another conversation with Kevin and another guest to talk about crossing another chasm soon. In the meantime, you're listening to Earth911. This is Mitch Ratcliffe. Sustainability in your ear is the podcast, and we encourage you to take care of yourself, take care of one another, and take care of the planet. We'll be back soon.